Hey guys, Tyler here. After the death of George Floyd, many people, and rightfully so, felt very upset and disturbed about what actually occurred to him. And after that particular death, there were many people who were actually interested in many books related to anti-racism. For example, the top selling books according to the New York Times were books such as White Fragility, as well as How to Be Anti-Racist. And since then, many companies started to employ ideas such as diversity, equity, and inclusion within their business and how to basically tackle issues about unconscious bias and racism within their own personal employees. When somebody hears the word anti-racist, normally they would probably say to yourself, how can you not be against racism? And obviously, most people assume that to be anti-racist and most use of the word is to be against something that's actually hurting people based upon their race. However, for that particular case during the early 2000s, it seemed as though that the anti-racists end up being the biggest racist. Why exactly am I saying that particular statement? Now, more recently, there has been a new study that came out about the particular issues of diversity, equity, inclusion. And so, without further hesitation, let's take a look at that particular study. This particular study is called How DEI Pedagogy Produced a Hostile Attribution Bias. A 2023 study by the Pew Research Center found that 52% of American workers had DEI meetings or training events at work. This study focused on diversity training interventions that emphasize awareness of and opposition to systemic oppression, a trend fueled by 2020 Black Lives Matter movement and popularized by texts such as Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist. While not representative of all DEI pedagogy, anti-racism and anti-oppression pedagogy and interventions, material has seen widespread adoption across sectors like higher education and healthcare. Yet this pedagogy lacks rigorous evaluation of effectiveness, particularly with respect to reducing bias and improving interpersonal and intergroup dynamics. Study one sample to examine the impact of anti-oppressive pedagogical material on race. NCRI conducted a study evoking 423 undergrads employing a control experimental design. Participants were randomly assigned to one of two groups, one exposed to a neutral control essay about U.S. corn productions, and the other exposed to an essay which combined educational texts from predominant DEI scholars Ibram X. Kendi and Robert DiAngelo. Now here's the actual data results directly from the corn study. It says right here that the blue actually represents how many microaggressions that the applicant experienced, and about 35.4% felt that way. Now the yellow represents how much harm that the applicant experienced, and I think 25.5% felt that way. Now the purple represents how violent was the interviewer, and about 24.1% felt that way. Now the red represents how biased was the admissions officer, and about 20.6% felt that way. When it comes down to the blue, it asks how fair was the applicant's rejection, about 12% felt that way. The orange represents was the applicant's a person of color, and about 10.6% felt that way. Now the green represents was the admissions officer's decision racially biased, about 9.4% felt that way. And about 4.5 who represent the pink actually asked was the admissions officer white. While discussions about Islamophobia, I hate that word Islamophobia, and racial discrimination were prevalent in DEI narratives, Caste-based discrimination among American Hindus has not been a core part of DEI discourse or training. Caste is a social hierarchy originating from British and Portuguese colonial policies in South Asia, which historically divided people into groups based upon a hereditary occupation and fostered discrimination between upper caste members and lower caste ones. Widely known in India, the issue of caste discrimination is recently gaining attention in the US. It has resulted in the inclusion of caste sensitivity training in academia, corporate, and legislative settings. What's so incredibly interesting about this one is that more respondents actually saw Hindus as racist after going through the DEI training. Similarly, the caste study revealed a significant increase in agreement with demonizing statements adapted from Adolf Hitler's quotes, where the term Jew was replaced with Brahmin, a group often depicted as oppressors in caste narratives. Participants exposed to the DEI content were markedly more likely to endorse Hitler's demonization statements, agreeing that Brahmins are parasites, viruses, and the devil personified. These findings suggest that exposure to anti-oppressive narratives can increase the endorsement of the type of demonization and scapegoating characteristic of authoritarianism. Now let's look at the data right here. Now, 35.4% think that they're basically parasites in comparison to the yellow, which represents like 33.8% who are viruses, and 27.1% think that they're basically the devil impersonated. Here are the final conclusions of the study. Number 1, anti-oppressive intervention. DEI training, rooted in anti-oppressive rhetoric, introduce narratives that leads people to assume that certain groups are inherent oppressors and others as inherent victims. Number 2, increase racial suspicion. Exposure led to hostile attribute bias, causing participants to see discrimination where there is no evidence that discrimination has occurred, driving racial prejudice into group hostility, suspicion, and division. Number 3, authoritative policing. This heightened suspicion triggers authoritative policing tendencies, leading people to endorse surveillance and purity testing, strict social controls, and escalating response from coercive to coercive. Participants show greater support for extreme punitive measures against perceived oppressors. 5, more calls for interventions. The heightened punitive atmospheres feedbacks into demands for more anti-oppressive DEI training, creating a self-enforcing cycle of suspicion and intolerance. To give you guys a clear-cut example about how extreme the material that they actually used in the study was, let's read a quotation that comes directly from the book that was called White Fragility. People of color may also hold prejudices and discriminate against white people, but they lack the social and institutional power that transforms their prejudice and discrimination into racism. That's right, guys, you heard that correctly. I could be biased against a person. I could be prejudiced against a person. But because I lack that institutional power, I simply cannot be racist against white people. But that's not all. Here's a quotation that comes directly from How to Be Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. If racial discrimination is defined as treating, considering, or making a distinction in favor or against an individual based upon a person's race, then racial discrimination is not inherently racist. The defining question is whether the discrimination is creating equity or inequity. If discrimination is creating equity, then it's anti-racist. If discrimination is creating inequity, then it is racist. Some reproducing inequities through permanently assisting an overrepresented racial group into wealth and power is entirely different than someone challenging that inequity by temporarily assisting an unrepresented group into relative wealth and power until equity is achieved. The only remedy to racial discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. Let's take this to its logical conclusion. Because, I guess, black people were enslaved, that will mean that whatever kind of enslavement that they actually experience, the future enslavement of white people is actually justified because they were enslaved directly. Again, how can these people claim to be anti-racist? Like, it's just so baffling to me how the study showed that more people became more hostile because of DEI training. The books like Kendi's or like Robert DiAngelo are saying stuff which basically essentially says that people cannot be racist based upon their skin color. That people are justified to discriminate other people based upon their race. Like, the anti-racists in this scenario are like the biggest racists. I don't understand it. But anyway, guys, what do you guys think about the study? Tell me in the comment section down below. And as always, I'll see you guys next video.